We are welcoming Mr. Tihomir Rangelov, who is a postdoctoral researcher in languages in different parts of the world, but he based more here in Vanuatu. Good morning and welcome to 96.3 Bars FM.
Good morning, Kizzy, and thank you for the invitation.
Now, we're going to talk about your interests, your work here in Vanuatu, but first, give us a little bit of your history, how you discovered Vanuatu. When was the first time for you to come over to Vanuatu, and what that interest that lead you to Vanuatu?
Yeah, it's actually a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. So basically, after finishing some of my studies, I wanted to travel the world, and I didn't have a lot of money, so I was backpacking, cheaply. And on one trip, I just wanted to come to the Pacific because I thought it was a fascinating region. Mm-hmm. And because I had training in linguistics, Melanesia is one of the places with the highest concentration of different languages. So I did a long trip so I stayed a couple of months in West Papua, and then a couple of months in Papua New Guinea, and then the Solomon Islands, and then I came and stayed a couple of months in Vanuatu, hitchhiking on boats mm-hmm. and traveling on cargo ships. And I thought the whole region was fascinating, but in Vanuatu I just fell in love with just the place was so beautiful and the people were so nice. And during these 2 months that I spent here, I visited different communities, but more specifically I was introduced to some people from Aham, or Aham is in the local language, but it's Akam Island, mm-hmm. I think it's more well known.
In Malekula.
In South Malekula. Mm-hmm. So I met the late John Sala, who was later a member of parliament, but at the time he wasn't yet. And I wanted to hear what their language sounded like, and I found out that their language had these very rare sounds that are called bilabial trills that are made with vibrations of the lips. It sounds something like mbr. So, for example, they say the word for pig is nambroas.
Wow.
And the word for flower is naprusun. Yeah, and I remembered from my phonetics classes back at uni that these sounds are extremely, extremely rare in the world. And I thought, oh, wow, this is fascinating. And before that, I had studied in Iceland, actually. I finished a degree there, and they offered me a PhD position there, but I was not ready to start it. Mm-hmm. But after discovering this, I was like, no, I have to switch completely from the North Atlantic. I was studying Scandinavian languages first, and then I wanted to do my PhD actually with the Aham language, because it was not documented before, there was no dictionary, there was no grammar. So I applied for funding from this program called the Endangered Languages Documentation Program. They funded my whole PhD. I moved to New Zealand, and that was 2017 and 18. I spent 9 months on Aham Island. I have an adoptive family there still, and we recorded a lot of stories, a lot of language. We annotated it, as you have to do this kind of work. It's called language documentation.
But before coming to the Pacific, you originally from Bulgaria.
Yes, I'm from Bulgaria, which is a small country in Southeast Europe.
And from there, you only have one language spoken in that country, or how many languages?
Well, we have one language. Most European countries are what we call monolingual, predominantly, which means that usually you use the same language at home, in school, in church, in media, everything. So in Bulgaria, that's Bulgarian. That's my mother tongue. That's the language I learned at home. My parents spoke it. But there are communities in Bulgaria that speak other languages, like Turkish, Roma, Armenian, etc. So these people are usually bilingual. So bilingualism or multilingualism, where you use more than one language in daily life, is actually more widespread in the world. So that's what a lot of people in Vanuatu are like. They have their vernacular that they speak at home in the villages, but then they speak Bislama, then they might speak English, French, etc., and they might speak a few other vernaculars.
Yes.
So, but in many so-called developed countries, actually Bulgaria is not one of the most developed countries, but, many Western countries, let's say, you usually have one language, with some exceptions, like Switzerland or Luxembourg, there are exceptions. But yes, I grew up with just one language. I started learning English when I was, I think, 10. and then later I studied some other languages, and I studied Scandinavian languages in Bulgaria, and then I moved to Scandinavia to study more there.
And here we are.
And here we are in the South Pacific.
In the South Pacific.
Yeah.
Now, when you travel, when you've got this first interest of research on that language, what really strike you? You mentioned the pronunciation that you make a funny
Sound by
yes,
labial
sound
trill, yeah.
by using your lips. Same like some languages in South Africa that they use some the clips or something. Yeah. So Vanuatu in Akam is the only place that you find that they have to use their lips to make that sound.
The bilabial trill, well, yeah, that I was fascinated by this. So my PhD was to write the grammar and sort of dictionary and stuff like this for Aham, but these sounds were because I'm interested in phonetics and phonology, so I researched further these sounds, and we actually recently have a publication together with my PhD supervisor in New Zealand and my new group leader, Dr. Mary Walworth in Germany, about the history of these sounds, because I was interested why do they use these sounds and why do not other languages use them. But in fact, in Malekula, there are about 23 languages, I think, that have. So Malekula has about 42 distinct languages, and 23 of them have bilabial trills. So they usually have only one, like this mbr sound, but a few have mbr, but they also have pr, which is without the M part in the beginning. So they are concentrated, Malekula looks like a sitting dog. So the head of the dog, like in North Malekula, they don't have them. But below the dog's neck, a lot of languages have them. And some have lost them, or it's documented that they've lost them, like in the past decades. Some seem to be losing them because only older people
are using
use them. But on Aham, they're actually quite used, quite frequently used by a lot of people. It's not just Aham; it's all of Southeast Malekula, especially. They're very widespread in the sort of central east coast of Malekula as
So
well.
your research is based on documentation as well.
Yes.
I mean, recording the pronunciation, recording the sound, and recording some of the words that have lost or have been used for some time and then disappear. And this is the work that you've been doing for some time in Akam.
Yes.
And you're only concentrating in Akam Island?
Well, that was for my PhD. So for my PhD was the language, what we call language documentation and description of Aham. So documentation means you record speech, whether you ask people, how do you say sky, how do you say water, how do you say sea, and then you record that and you write it down. But you also record like stories, people telling custom stories, people telling you how they weave mats or something like this. And then what's very important is that you annotate them, which means you write down what they're saying in the language and then a translation into Bislam or English or French or whatever, some bigger language. Because let's say this language disappears one day, as many languages are endangered, at least we will know.
That's right.
What they were saying, and based on this, you create what we call a corpus. So for Aham, I have around 22 hours of annotated recordings, and for my PhD dissertation, I had to write a grammar, which involved like just looking at these recordings and making inferences about how the structure of the language is, like do nouns come before adjectives, and they actually don't have really adjectives.
How you put that sound brr into writing? How grammatically? How
we had to decide with the community how to spell it, because we needed an orthography, like a spelling system, and we've settled on a double B. So BB is a brr.
The double B, like B for ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, for example, you have something like mbus. Mbus means plain, or what in Bislam is nothing. Like, and it's spelled B-U-S. And mbrus, which means to squeeze, like when you squeeze kava or something. That's spelled B-B-U-S.
So you speak fluently their language?
Well, I wouldn't say fluently, but also that was before COVID, and then there were about 4 years when I didn't come to Vanuatu. But I did go to Aham last year for just a week. I know the structure of their language quite well, I think, because I wrote the grammar of it, but I don't speak it fluently, but yes, I understand when they speak, and I can speak a little bit. Yeah.
Now, there's a big conference is happening next week
Next week,
here
yes.
in Port Vila
Yeah.
that will bring together all the expert of languages here in Vanuatu and overseas to be part of this conference, which is a third conference hosted by Vanuatu in the country, but organized by Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Lisbon, Germany.
Yeah.
Now, why this conference is only concentrating in Vanuatu? Is it because of all the researchers are only based and research languages of this country?
Yeah, well, there are different conferences. For example, Oceanic Languages Conference, which is hosted by different countries every 2 years, and then you talk about all the oceanic languages, etc., or Pacific languages. But we wanted to have a meeting that is specifically for Vanuatu languages, and this is the third one so far. It's always been held in Port Vila, and I think it should be. The first one was, I believe, 2006, and there was a big gap, and then in 2018 was the second one. That's 5 years ago. I was actually doing my research on Aham back then, and I presented about those bilabial trios at that conference. And now the third one is taking place now 5 years later, because we just want to catch up with all linguists, both from Vanuatu and from overseas, who work on Vanuatu languages, to catch up on what we've been doing during these years, who has been working on what the next steps in the research on Vanuatu languages will be. So I am proud to be one of the conveners of this conference, together with Dr. Lana Takao, who is a local linguist. She's from Pentecost, but she's also been working on a language in Malekula. And we are both part of this COOL group. So COOL stands for Comparative Oceanic Linguistics, that is led by Dr. Mary Walworth, and it's hosted by the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. We have a Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution that's led by Professor Russell Gray, and it's based in Leipzig in Germany. So that's where I live and where I travel from when I come to Vanuatu. So we wanted to host this to organize this conference in order to catch up and meet all the other linguists, because some of them are based in Australia, New Zealand, USA, Europe, and yeah.
So how many linguists that we are expecting in this conference, and what are the dates?
So first of all, I should say that all the information is on the conference website, which is, the URL is a bit long, but if people Google Vanuatu Languages Conference, it usually is the first hit. So it will start on Monday morning, and it will last until Thursday, including Thursday. And we're expecting, I think overall we have over 50 people who have registered to attend, but the presenters
across the globe.
Yeah. It will not be. It's not hybrid or online or anything. They're all
face to face
going to be here. But not all are presenting. I think. Well, there are 42 presentations. And I think we have about 37 people who are presenting. So, and there are a few who unfortunately couldn't come for various reasons. So there are, I would say, 40 or 50 linguists or sort of anthropologists who work on language-related things that work in Vanuatu or have worked in Vanuatu in the last years. Of course, we've lost some, like Terry Crowley and Professor John Lynch, who passed away recently. Since the last conference, but yeah, there are a lot of young researchers who are doing research on Vanuatu languages, and that's very exciting, including Ni Vanuatu researchers.
So how many researchers from Vanuatu? Because I know of Dr. Takao. But,
yes, Dr. Takao, and there is a PhD student from Fiji who is presenting. I believe, and we'll have a few attendees who are going to be there and watch. And there are a couple of co-presenters, like local leaders, community leaders, or teachers who are presenting together with linguists that they've been working with in the past, or they're working with now, because when we do this kind of work with all these languages, we don't just go there and work in isolation. We always partner with the communities. And I have two men from Aham are coming actually over to attend part of the conference and this training, which will take place after the conference.
So why so important to have such conference and bringing together all those experts of languages together?
Well,
is Vanuatu losing most of its languages?
Well, Vanuatu is the country with most languages per capita in the world. So it is fascinating how this linguistic diversity exists and how it came into being. That's one of the things we are researching, actually. We want to know why this happened here and it didn't happen somewhere else. So it's fascinating. I think most indigenous languages of Vanuatu are endangered to a certain extent, but language endangerment is not a yes or no thing. There's different levels, and usually people look at how much language is transmitted to children. So if children still speak it, then it's probably more or less safe. But if children are no longer speaking it, then it means that in 20 or 40 years, when these last generations pass, the language will be lost. Most Vanuatu languages, I would say, are not moribund like this. They're not going to necessarily be lost, but just the fact that they are not used in many different domains, as we say, because many of them are just used at home, but in school, in church, in communication outside of the community, that they are not really used that much, and this not in the media, for example.
Is it because of the introduction of Bislama coming into the daily lives?
Well, certainly, if they're not used in all domains, then it means that something else is used in those domains, and this is very often Bislama or English or French, whatever, in schools. But we don't want to blame it on, we don't want Bislama to be the black sheep or English or French or anything, because, as I said, people here are and have been for millennia happily multilingual and using many different languages in their daily lives. So there is no problem. It's just that it's just a matter of attitude sometimes, because language is not just a means of communication. It's also an identity marker. So identify through our language. And sometimes if you have negative attitudes towards a language, you actually have negative attitudes towards your identity as well, and that can lead to a lot of social change and stuff. So they pull each other. Like, social change can create these language attitudes, and language attitudes can also promote social change in one direction or another. So one point that we always try to make is that these indigenous languages are as worth the languages as any other language. They have their structure, they have their grammar, they're extremely interesting. In some of them you can express amazing things, that you can't express in English or French, but every language is like this. Every language is unique, and we just want to make sure that the communities appreciate that, and most communities understand it. Like, I've interviewed people on Aham and elsewhere, like, what do you think, is it important to preserve your language? And they usually say language mi stampa custom, like it's a vehicle for your Melanesian identity, and and you don't want to lose this Melanesian identity, and you certainly don't want to lose it very fast, because then that leads to social problems afterwards. And I think these different identities and these different languages can happily coexist. We just need to do the work to document these languages, to do all of this that's necessary in order to be able to boost sort of the status and the attitudes towards these languages.
So that's another way of preserving a language. But another way of preserving the language, if you have to speak it. every
Yes.
day in your
Yeah.
life.
Yes. Yes.
And then you can pass on the language to your next generation, to other generations in a near future. Now, give us a real data of Vanuatu languages, because some are saying Vanuatu has 115 languages, 120, 130. Now, through your research and other researchers that studied languages in Vanuatu, how many languages that Vanuatu people has?
So it's a very big question in linguistics, like what's a language and what's a dialect, and
That's right.
and then usually people say if two people speak, like linguists usually talk of language varieties. So we don't really care whether you call it a language or a dialect, because if on this island they do the bilabial trill, like they say Namboas, but on the next one they say Namboas. For me, it's not really important whether these are two varieties that are one language, two dialects, or because I'm just interested in, the one. If I'm researching bilabial trills, I'll be interested in the variety that does that, But it doesn't mean they're not part of the same language. And usually, if you have to use the term language, usually it's a matter of politics. So basically, if two communities, even if they speak very closely related varieties, if they identify as different communities, they usually say, oh, these people there speak a different language, And because languages evolve in the future, this might mean that these two varieties, even if they're mutually intelligible, like they can understand each other, in the future they might not understand each other anymore, right? But if you use just this criterion of whether they understand each other or not, I would say, I think the number of 120, 130 is very, very probable. Now I have to say as well that actually, since you mentioned that, and I didn't say like whether I've only been working on a hump. Right now, I actually work on languages in Santo, and
Yes.
I'm
A
doing
survey.
this survey. Yes,
Yes.
and I have historical. I've read, of course, all the historical literature, and there's been like Darrow Tryon has done this survey in the 70s. And for example, I've done most of the west coast. I've surveyed most of the west coast of Santo. I've just come back from the west coast the other day. And yes, for example, in the other books that exist, they say, oh, on the west coast is like 3 different languages. But when you go and look at it in detail, I record like in every village, more or less. And then, yes, I see that in village A, they speak like this. In village B, it's a bit different, but, it's almost the same. They understand. You ask them, they say, oh, yeah, we totally understand each other. I speak my own, they speak their own, but we understand each other. And then slowly you move down the coast, and then you sort of switch into a area where they don't understand each other very much with those ones in the far north.
Because of
right?
distance, or?
Yeah, because they just slowly, these changes, these differences in the different varieties pile up. And so it's like what we call a dialect continuum, right? But what I've discovered is that there are a lot of small languages, and some of them moribund because they are only spoken by the older generations of people who, for example, in the 50s came down from the bush and now live by the sea. And for example, they switched because, for example, the missionaries who were there, or they were converted to Christianity by local people, and then because that was the language that this community spoke, it was more prestigious, so they switched to it, and they have lost more or less the variety that they spoke up in the bush, which can be very similar, but actually can be quite different as well. And there was one village in northwest where the last speaker of their own language actually had died just two months before I went there, but there were a lot of people who remembered some words in it, so I sat down and recorded those words. But I have this photo of the grave of this man who that's the language went with him. That's what they said. And
But at least you met him.
I did. No,
I mean, you
didn't-
didn't meet him,
meet
but
him, but
you
I met-
have knowledge of his existence.
I record. Yes,
Wow.
and I recorded these and documented it. But so yes, there are as we go and record in every village, some small languages like this pop up here and there. So the number is probably a little bit higher than what we have in the books so far. So I would bet on the higher, like maybe 130 or so.
130 languages
Yeah.
here in Vanuatu. Now, those languages are pure languages, or they also use some imported words from different islands or different countries, like English, French, into their language and Bislama.
They do borrow words, but every language does. Like French, English is how many percent French words, and it's still English, and yes, it's completely normal to borrow words, but they still use a lot of their own vocabulary. I record in the West Coast about 500 words for each village or for each language, because some villages have actually two different ones. And I would say these are basic vocabulary, like things that you mention every day, in your life, and or custom-related things, plants, animals, taro, yams, etc. And most of the time they use local words, but of course for things like phone and boat and truck,
of course, these are important
words. Although it's amazing. I've actually started asking for those words, because it's amazing. In some languages they actually invent local words for those. And for example, the truck can be
Loto?
Either something with 4 wheels, or in one language I recorded just like last week, it was a crab. So the word for crab, because it was like moving with, I don't know, the way
so
a crab does.
Is referred to a truck.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of data of islands that they do have their languages documented, do we know that?
I would say just off the top of my head, I would say half of them are documented to some extent.
From north to south of Vanuatu?
From north to south. There have been a lot of people working on a lot of languages. As I said, mentioned Terry Crowley and John Lynch, and a lot of people who are coming to this conference. Some of them have been working here for over 20 years. But when I say documented, it really depends. Some of them have a 400-page grammar and a 5,000-word dictionary, which is quite a lot for our standard, and some of them just have maybe a short grammar sketch of 100 pages and a word list of 2,000 words, so it's obviously not the same. And for some we might not have a full grammar, but just some people worked on them. And documented means that we basically have those recordings that are annotated, and then people can work with them to either create literacy materials for the schools or for the community, whatever the community wishes are, and then someone can use them to actually write these descriptions, like the grammar and the thing. So I would say about half of them. A big blank spot I would say is Santo, because just some areas of Santo are so inaccessible,
remote,
and yes, many parts in west and central in the highlands of Santo have been very underrepresented in the literature. So you have a lot in.
But there are people there.
Of course, and they speak their own languages. And well, that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to survey them to see actually how many varieties are there, how many different languages, which ones are more urgent maybe to document before they go extinct, or in which ones do I find, this is a little bit selfish perhaps, but in which ones do I find interesting features in the grammar that I'm personally interested in and I want to document and write about and explore, because these interesting features because Vanuatu languages are very different. Like if you hear a language from Tana and one from Malekula, they're just completely different from each other, but their structures follows like similar patterns, of course, because they are all from the same group, more or less, except for the 3 Polynesian languages, which are also oceanic, but they're sort of other subgroup. But sometimes those weird things that you find in one particular language can tell you a lot about the history of that language, or why this strange thing first developed, and then why do people hold on to it, which oftentimes has to do with identity. It has to do with different parts of the structure of the language.
So in Vanuatu, what sorts of languages are spoken in those different islands of Vanuatu? Because we do have the Polynesian languages spoken here in some parts of Vanuatu, like Ifira, my island, Malay, Futuna, and the southern part, Aniwa.
And
and the Emai, Whakamai, Whakemai. So the other languages in Vanuatu, how we call them?
So they are. So this is big oceanic subgroup of languages. It has over 500, I think, languages, and these are languages starting from Papua New Guinea, parts of Papua New Guinea, and throughout like remote Melanesia, which is basically almost every language in the Solomon Islands is oceanic, and then everything in Vanuatu and all the other small islands, including New Zealand and Hawaii and Easter Island. And then they have different subgroups. So the ones in Vanuatu and New Caledonia are usually grouped into this sort of southern oceanic subgroup. And then within that, you have a North Central Vanuatu subgroup, which basically starting from here, from Efate, and north to the Banks and Torres. These are North Central Vanuatu, and the Southern Vanuatu are sometimes grouped by themselves or together with the languages of Kanaki, like the New Caledonia. And yes, but they are still, part of this big subgroup. But the Polynesian outliers, as we call them, because they're outliers because they're outside of this Polynesian triangle, these are were brought by Polynesian speakers who migrated back west and settled in these islands, and there are such languages also in the Solomons and in PNG.
Now, in Vanuatu's languages, do we have a similarity? A small word that other Melanesian countries have similar words in Vanuatu languages?
Oh yeah, yes.
Yeah?
Yes. For example, the word for water is in Aham, it's woi. In Polynesian languages, it's y. It can be y or some. Yes.
So there's similarity.
Yeah, yes. So also, for example, Tana. Tana means ground. You actually can go, because oceanic languages are actually a subgroup of an even bigger thing, and the biggest thing is called the Austronesian language family, which is one of the largest families in the world, and that covers languages in the Philippines, in Indonesia, even in Madagascar, in Africa. These people traveled very far in their canoes. And for example, Tana, which means ground in some Vanuatu languages, it's the same word in Indonesia that means ground. Yes. In Aham, it's actually ran, because the T changed into R in many cases, and the final vowel was lost. So Tana became like ran or something like this. Yeah.
Interesting to learn about those existing languages in different islands of Vanuatu, and Akam is a special one, and you've been researching on that language for some years now, and you're based in Germany, but you went to Santo to do your work, a survey, as you mentioned earlier, a survey of languages of Sando. But you're also in the pipeline to have some kind of dictionary. So tell us more about that. So it's going to be the first time ever for Santo languages to have a dictionary?
Some Santo languages have been well documented and have some dictionaries. But actually, what I'm working on, and one of the biggest outcomes of our group, the cool group at the Max Planck Institute, is that we've been working on this database called Vanuatu Voices. So if you go and Google Vanuatu Voices, it pops up. And then you go and you have a map of Vanuatu, and you can click on different villages and go, and it's like a dictionary of words. For some, in the past, they were collecting only 200 words. Now I'm collecting over 500. So the Santo data is not up on the database yet, because we need to curate it first a little bit and work on it. But we have all of Malekula. We have 139 villages in Malekula, so more than one speaker for each language, because some languages are spoken in different villages. And as I said before, sometimes you have different small differences, so we want to catch those. So we have all of Malekula, I think Epi, Pentecost, Maiwo, and I think Efat is being worked on now, Ambai, but Santo, Torba, Ambrim, and South Vanuatu are still missing So we are working on that. I'm working on the Santo variety. So each, I mean, you can think of each dot that you click on, and then you get the list of words as a small dictionary, small online dictionary. Because and the best thing is that you can also click and hear the word. Because when I record them, I actually record them with a microphone and everything, and then I go and cut them piece by piece, and then I write them. Yeah.
So that if I want to learn Akam language, I just go and click on Akam and then learn how to pronounce any word.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I can speak
They are
it.
transcribed. You have translations in Bislama and English. Yes.
Now, you mentioned about the data of languages Vanuatu has. Now, is there a data of languages that they are disappearing in Vanuatu? I mean, like Vanuatu is losing out of some of languages that is not longer spoken by people?
Yeah, I think out of those 130 or whatever we decide on, there is a small number that are moribund, as we call them, and many times it's because of that situation that I described earlier, where some people moved from somewhere to a new place, and they were sort of integrated, so to say, in a new community, and they lost them. Such small languages are found all the time. Like, actually, when I was on Hamb, people told me, oh yeah, there were these people who, in the beginning of the 20th century, came down from the bush, and some of them came to Hamb, and some of them live on the mainland, and just a few older people still speak this language. And I know about another one in Malekula that Lana wrote about, and this one I told you about in Santo. So I would say there are not too many, but at least 10 or 20 that we know of. There might be more that we don't.
Along a period of how many years?
I would say just in the past 50 years, since there's been like so much research on Vanuatu languages, because before that there was not much really, just a few missionaries.
So that's from north to the south of Vanuatu.
Yes.
So
like
every
this.
island experience a language that is no longer exist within the community.
Or it will soon stop to exist.
Wow.
Yes.
So what is your advice here for us people in Vanuatu to preserve our language? I mean, you do the documentation, but for us as a human speaking those languages?
I think, as I mentioned before, like attitudes are very important. So people need to, well, I think most people, as I said, appreciate. They know what the value of their local languages is, and for example, the knowledge about plants, about animals, and things like this. But I think there are different conflicting attitudes sometimes, because I think people just think that if I speak to my children in their vernacular, they will not learn English well, or something like this, and they need English to have better job opportunities or Bislama. But one thing doesn't exclude the other. You can do both. Like I was raised speaking only one language. It wasn't English, but I learned English well enough to be talking to you right now, right? So that's one thing. And to have just these positive attitudes towards these languages. And one thing I have discovered as well is that many times you go to the communities, and when I ask for a speaker to record, I usually want like an older person who has more knowledge and remembers more things and has more experience, and that's understandable. But a lot of times you hear younger people say, well, if I approached a young person to record, they would say, oh no, I don't know the language well, it's the Olfala or Lisava language. But I think, I mean, this is sort of true, but at the same time, it should not be true, because young people shouldn't feel like they're not good enough, or like they're doing something wrong. Because in every language, everywhere in the world, young people speak differently than old people, because language evolves, it changes all the time, and it's not worse. It's just different. And if the young people want to preserve all the knowledge that the older people have, they need to be included and they need to be involved. And now with all of this technology that we have, like all these smartphones and all of these, the availability of internet and stuff like this, means that young people who have a better grip on this technology can partner with their abus in the communities, record them, get knowledge from them, make small picture dictionaries, if you wish, of plants, of animals, and all this knowledge that we, like the professional linguists, have, we can assist them in doing this. And actually, this is a place to mention that after the conference, we'll have this workshop. Actually, it's organized by the Endangered Languages Documentation Program. These are the people who funded my PhD that I mentioned earlier. And we are helping them with that because they will sponsor partially people from coming from different islands who are speakers of these languages to come and learn how to do language documentation, like how to record language, how to put it in the computer, how to annotate it with special software, to write down what's being said, to translate it, how to apply even for grants to do this kind of work in the future.
Yes.
So because
it needs
ELDP
money to do that.
Yeah. So the conference is from Monday to Thursday next week, and then the training will be on Friday, Saturday, and then on the Monday and Tuesday after next week. And we are very happy. I have, as I said, 2 men from Aham, and I have 3 people from Santo that I've met that are coming for this. But there'll be, I think, over 50 different people who are, some of them are based in Port Vila, some are students. It's not only young people, but I think it's very, very important that we engage young people. And actually, during the conference, we'll have a special session on Wednesday on collaboration between outsider linguists like myself and local communities and local people who just take over this work, because we are doing this work, but it means we have to travel, we have to come here. And you know, now when I think back about the first time I went to Aham, I was like, oh my God, I've done so many things wrong and so many things I missed, you know. And if the locals do it and I just assist them, it's just so much more beautiful. So yes,
they understand their language,
yes,
and they know their people,
and they are good. They're good at it. You know, they can use the technology. They yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Tihomir Rangelov, who is also a researcher in languages, different languages here in Vanuatu. Thank you very much for taking time, joining 96.3 Buzz FM, giving us the interest of languages in Vanuatu, the data of languages in Vanuatu, and your work documenting all the languages of Vanuatu with your colleague linguist from different countries that are coming over to Vanuatu this weekend to attend the important conference, the 3rd conference of language that will be hosted here in Port Vila next week. So again, we'll definitely follow up on that story pack again in languages in Vanuatu, and we'll definitely get some more other guests joining us and give us more some research work done in different islands.
Thank you. And I would like to say that the conference will be held at the National University of Vanuatu, who very generously provided space. And also on Wednesday afternoon, they are organizing their own satellite event where the place of language and languages in education will be discussed. So the conference and this event are both open to the public, so people are welcome to come and join and listen, as long as there is space, of course. But thank you for the publicity, and thank you for inviting me. And
You're most welcome.
Great. Thank you very
You're
much.
most welcome.